And I invite you, if you're able to rise as we open the Ark, and we're going to take out our Sifrei Torah. And we are going to be in the middle of page 204.
Or zarua latzadik u'leYisrael simcha. 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 A light is sown in each and every heart. In each and every heart a light is sown. A light is sown in each and every heart. In each and every heart a light is sown. Or zarua latzadik u'leYisrael simcha. Or zarua latzadik u'leYisrael simcha. Each and every heart a light is sown. A light is sown in each and every heart. In each and every heart a light is sown. Yeshiva shel Mala Uvishiva shel mata al tat hamakom va'al dat hakal anu matirin להתפלל im havaryanim v'yeshiva shel malach v'yeshiva shel matach
על דעת המקום ועל דעת הקהל. אנו מתירים להתפלל עם העבריינים.
בשיבה של מעלה ובשיבה של מטה, על דעת המקום ועל דעת הקהל, אנו מתירים להתפלל עם העבריינים.
Kol Nidre v'yesarei v'charamei v'konamei v'chinuyei v'kinusei u'shavuot din darana Udaish tabana Udihacharimna Uda asarna Al nafshatana Miyom Kippur imazah At Yom Kippurim Haba Aleinu L'Tova B'chul hon Icharatna v'hon Kul hon Yehon Sharan Shevitin Betelin Mevutalin Lashiririn Velakayamin Nidrana La Nidre V'yesarna la'esarei u'shvuatana la'shavuot.
Two more.
Kol Nidre v'esarei v'charamei v'konamei v'chinuyei v'kinusei u'shavuot din darna Udaish tabana Uda acharim Sarana al Nashatana Yom Kippurim Masha'avar Ad Yom Kippurim Zeh Yom Kippurim Zeh Ad Yom Kippurim Ay, 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 ay Haba Eleinu La Torah Kulhon Icharatna Bahon Kulhon Yahancharan Shavikin Shavitin V'teinu Mavutalim La Sharin V'la Kayamin Nidrana la Nidre Ve'esarana la Esarei Ushvuatana La Shavuot
Kol Nidre V'yasarei V'haramei V'konamei V'chinuyei V'kinusei U'shavuot Din Darna U'deishtabana U'da'acharimna Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. V'dasarana al nafshatana miyom kippurim zeh ad yom kippurim haba ay 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 aleinu letova kulhon icharatna v'hon kulhon yohon sharan shavikin shavitin בטלין ומבוטלין לא שריירין ולא קיימים נדרנה לנדרה ואסרנה לאסרה ay 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 ושפטנה לשבועות
ונסלח לכל עדת בני ישראל ולגר הגר בתוכם כי לכל העם בשגגה
ונסלח לכל עדת בני ישראל ולגר הגר בתוכם כי לכל העם בשגגה
ונסלח לכל עדת בני ישראל ולגר הגר בתוכם כי לכל העם בשגגה
סלח נא לעוונם הזה כגודל חסדך וכאשר נסעת לעם הזה ממצרים ועד הנה ושם נאמר
ויאמר אדוני סלחתי כדבריך
ויאמר אדוני סלחתי כדבריך
ויאמר אדוני סלחתי כדבריך
יאמר אדוני סלחתי כדבריך
ויאמר אדוני סלחתי כדבריך
ויאמר אדוני סלחתי כדבריך
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
אמן.
Demasi and I get to sit in those two chairs. Yeah. I think that's where we should sit.
You know the story of the Jewish mother who buys her son 2 lovely silk ties for his birthday, one yellow and one purple. He's agonizing a little bit about which one he should actually wear when he goes later that evening to meet his mother for the birthday celebration. And eventually he puts on the purple one. When he arrives at his mother's house, she says, "The yellow tie you didn't like?" Thank you. I'll be here all night. You know, some of you know my dad loved to tell jokes. He told so many jokes. In fact, he had a book of 337 first lines of jokes that he could just tell on demand. And that one was definitely in his repertoire. It was one of the clean ones. But of course, it's based on the stereotype, in a way, that the source of our Jewish guilt comes from our mothers. And there are also jokes, of course, that compare Jewish guilt with Catholic guilt or Italian guilt, you know, like the story, what's the difference between a Jewish mother and an Italian mother? An Italian mother says, if you don't eat, I'm going to kill you, and a Jewish mother says, if you don't eat, I'm going to kill myself. But apologies, really, my apologies to mothers, especially my mother, who's actually in hospital this Yom Kippur, to Italians, to Jews, to Catholics. Oi, now I feel guilty. Sorry, Mum. Anyone else feeling guilty? No? What are you doing here then? Seriously, where does Jewish guilt come from? We surely can't continue to blame our mothers for it. A little self-disclosure, and not a surprise to those of you who know me, I actually feel guilty a lot of the time. Caught in an almost constant niggling feeling that I'm supposed to be doing something else, something that I'm not doing, making calls, writing, working out, eating better food, visiting more people, giving more tzedakah, helping relieve the sufferings of others, helping save the world. Frankly, too much time is wasted in not doing any of these things. Yet that feeling, the sting of guilt and even shame over the incredible privilege that I also feel, the privilege and wealth and opportunities that I have compared to so many people in this country and around the world. And then, of course, sometimes my dog Baruch looks at me in such a way that I feel incredibly guilty. You know, those eyes, really? You're going to go out and leave me here? So where does this guilt come from? Is it guilt or is it shame? And what's the difference, actually? And how does it relate to Yom Kippur? Does guilt serve us or not? There are profound and lasting ways in which guilt and shame appear in early childhood. The psychologist Erik Erikson speaks of stages of development. Shame versus autonomy. Shame versus autonomy is the focus of the second developmental stage. And guilt versus initiative is the third stage. In very basic terms, this means that if a child is in an environment where a sense of autonomy, of selfhood, is dismissed or minimized, then they will experience shame. On the other hand, if the child is put in an environment where initiative, taking initiative, is repressed through criticism and control, then they will develop a sense of guilt. If as children we get repeated messages that our choices, that our ideas are wrong or unwelcome, it will quickly get translated into shame and guilt responses that can continue to impact us for our whole lives. The ancient ritual of Yom Kippur that we're going to read about tomorrow was performed with 2 goats, one of which was slaughtered and one of which was sent off into the wilderness carrying all the sins of the people. The guilt, you could say, or the shame. I don't know which. The word scapegoat that is, of course, a common word in the English language, and there are a lot of scapegoats in our society, but the word scapegoat first came into the English language from a 16th century translation of the passage that we're reading tomorrow from Leviticus chapter 18. That goat carries the burden of our sins and releases us. Our contemporary Yom Kippur ritual is the repeated liturgy of confession, fessing up to our individual and collective guilt. In an essay on Parshat Acharei Mot, the passage in the Torah that we're reading about, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who I quote almost every Shabbat in this year that he died, he quotes an anthropologist called Ruth Benedict, who defines the difference between shame cultures and guilt cultures. Shame cultures and guilt cultures. Shame, he says, is a social phenomenon. It is what we feel when our wrongdoing is exposed to others. It may even be something we feel when we merely imagine other people knowing or seeing what we have done. Shame is the feeling of being found out, and our first instinct is to hide. This is what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden after they'd eaten the forbidden fruit. They were ashamed of their nakedness and they hid. Guilt, on the other hand, is a personal phenomenon. It has nothing to do with what others might say if they knew what we have done, and everything to do with what we say to ourselves. Guilt is the voice of conscience, and it is inescapable. You may be able to avoid shame by hiding or just not being found out, but you cannot avoid guilt. Guilt is self-knowledge. That's the end of the quote by Jonathan Sacks. And in another essay, Rabbi Sacks says, shame is public humiliation and guilt is inner torment. Shame is public humiliation and guilt is inner torment. So which do we have more of here? Shame or guilt? I think a little bit of both, right? And is America a shame culture or a guilt culture? What about Judaism? Well, according to the anthropologist Ruth Benedict, ancient Greece and Japan are examples of shame cultures. Rabbi Sacks says that Judaism, however, is overwhelmingly a guilt culture rather than a shame culture. Oi, a guilt culture, of course it is. He says like this, shame attaches to the person, guilt attaches to the act. Shame attaches to the person, guilt attaches to the act. It is almost impossible, he says, to remove shame once you have been publicly disgraced. In shame cultures, wrongdoers tend to go into exiles when no one knows their past, into exile when no one knows their past, or they commit suicide. Playwrights have them die. In American culture, we almost daily see people in politics, entertainment, sport, business, publicly shamed by social media, often rightly so, perhaps, to have their reputations and even their whole lives destroyed. Often they're not given the chance to make amends. Guilty without trial, and truthfully, some good people have gone down. One of the more extreme examples is the 2013 story of a young woman called Justine Sacco, who sent a very inappropriate and probably racist tweet as she was about to board a plane in London on her way to Africa about the fear of catching AIDS. 11 hours later, when she landed, she discovered that her tweet had gone viral and she was branded a racist. She had become a pariah. Eventually, she lost her job and her name became infamous. Was the tweet inappropriate? Yes. Did she deserve to lose her whole reputation over it? I don't think so. Definitely not. Social media had tried her without defense or jury, and she was sentenced in the court of public opinion. Justine was given no chance for teshuvah, to reflect on her action and to make amends, to learn and to grow from her poor judgment. This is why Rabbi Sachs suggests that Judaism is predominantly a culture of guilt rather than shame, because guilt is about an act, a behavior, not the person, and ritual and sincere confession and apology can redeem the act and bring the person back into society. Hate not the sinner, but the sin. Public shaming and humiliation are seen as such grave offenses in Jewish tradition that it's actually equated to murder. The Talmud in Baba Metzias 58b, in a discussion about ana'at devarim, which is the sort of inappropriate use of words, says, quote, a disciple taught before Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, anyone who publicly mortifies his companion is comparable to a shedder of blood. He replied, your statement is correct, for the red color of the face disappears and it becomes white. Commentaries on this passage suggest that the whitening of the face that happens when someone feels publicly humiliated as the blood drains out is like the soul leaving the body, and therefore a kind of death. The professor and researcher and storyteller and writer Brené Brown, whose teachings on courage and vulnerability have had a very profound effect on many of us, I think, she makes some very similar distinctions between guilt and shame. She says, based on my research and the research of other shame researchers, can you imagine being a researcher where your field is all shame? I believe, she says, there is a profound difference between shame and guilt. I believe that guilt is adaptive and helpful. It's holding something we've done or failed to do up against our own values and feeling psychological discomfort. I define shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection, she says. That's shame. Something we're so caught up in the reality that we are not worthy of love and connection. She continues, she says, I don't believe shame is helpful or productive. In fact, I think shame is much more likely to be the source of destructive, hurtful behavior than the solution or cure. I think the fear of disconnection can make us dangerous. The fear of disconnection can make us dangerous. Yom Kippur and the ritual of the goats is really about both guilt and shame. It's about the personal and it's about the communal. It's about purification. It's about washing away that stain of shame that we think can never be removed. Will these hands ne'er be clean, cries Macbeth. It is also about atonement, at-one-ment, attunement, realignment, ritualized release from the act. Coming together as a community in collective confession, with each confessional prayer in the plural, we cover for each other. We atone together and avoid any one individual's public shaming. We release each other from shame as a community and as a society, while personally and individually focusing on the specific acts from which we want to be free. In Rabbi Sachs's words, when a whole society confesses its guilt, individuals can be redeemed from shame. When a whole society confesses its guilt, individuals can be redeemed from shame. As I said on Rosh Hashanah, we've all experienced trauma in so many ways. And we need, I believe, this process that we're entering into tonight to be loving, to be gentle, to be full of self-compassion rather than flagellation and self-loathing. We are together and alone in our inner world where our consciousness guides us, and in community where we have the capacity to release each other. Of course we have made mistakes. Of course we could have done better. Of course we did not live our best moments during this past year. How could we? In the High Holiday publication from Hadar in New York, Rabbi Ethan Tucker writes an article called "Forgive Us, for We Have Sinned," about the eternal power of the ritual of confession. He says, the one constant throughout time and space is the ability and the obligation of the Jew to sincerely admit wrongdoing. That, he says, is the gateway to return and renewal. The gateway to return and to renewal. So is the kind of relentless guilt that I mentioned at the beginning healthy and productive? Probably not, unless it motivates action and change. But Jewish culture and others can certainly get some of us caught up in cycles of unhealthy guilt where we constantly feel like we're doing something wrong and that we're bad, rather than what the heart of the spiritual tradition invites us into, a world that recognizes that to be human is to make mistakes, but that we are better not to attach the person to the act, knowing that we have confession, that we have prayer, that we have teshuvah, and that we have each other to release both the guilt and the shame. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, has a very, very powerful teshuvah prayer, a prayer of return, a kind of spiritual practice that invites us to find the nikudot tovot, the good little spots of goodness, even in those who we deem to be wicked or in those who have really hurt us, and ultimately, and of course, that's the hardest part of all for many of us, in ourselves. Rabbi Nachman ends that teaching in a translation by Rabbi Art Green like this. That's all you need to find. Just the smallest bit, a dot of goodness, that should be enough to give you back your life, to bring you back to joy by seeking out that little bit, even in yourself, and judging yourself that way. You show yourself that is who you are. You can change your whole life this way and bring yourself to teshuvah. It's that first little dot of goodness. That's the hardest one to find, or the hardest to admit you find. The next ones will come a little easier, each one following another. And you know what? You know what? These little dots of goodness in yourself, after a while, you will find that you can sing them. Join them to one another, and they become your nigun, your wordless melody. You fashion that nigun by rescuing your own good spirit from all that darkness and depression. The nigun brings you back to life. And then you can start to pray. The nigun brings you back to life. And then you can start to pray. Yes, teshuvah, return, is about an honest look at ourselves, the guilt and the shame, in the knowledge that there is a fundamental difference between an action, a word, a behavior that I regret, and who we are at our core. Teshuvah is also about reminding ourselves and others of these dots of pure goodness and singing and praying, restoring and redeeming them. There's a verse in Psalm 34 that starts, Sur meira ve'aseh tov. Turn away from evil and do good. Sur meira ve'aseh tov. This is often interpreted as a description of the two-phase process of teshuvah. First, turning away from the negative action, the ra, and turning towards and embracing the goodness, the tov. Let's open ourselves to the immense power of this day, this mikveh, this cleansing bath that we are in together, this Yom Kippur. allowing us to see ourselves and to see each other for who we are, rather than for what we may have done. Whatever the impact of our childhood development may have been in patterns of shame and guilt, on this day we say, Salach lanu ki chatanu, pardon us for we have sinned. Taking responsibility for ourselves and for our actions, not blaming others, especially not our mothers. Each of us able to see who we are as so much more than what we have done.